So we have with us a very special person who will introduce herself on her work on labor rights and migrants. Virginia, can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, my name is Virginia Mantouvalou and I'm a professor of human rights and labor law at UCL.
Wonderful. Virginia, could you tell us a bit about your work on migrant labor and also the work that you do with Kalayaan? Because it's so interesting.
Thank you. I've been working on migrant domestic workers many years now. So I started, it was during the time that when I was doing my PhD that I started working on the topic. And I started looking at the treatment of migrant domestic workers. I didn't know about this in the past before that, but slowly I continued doing research in the area. I realized that sometimes migrant domestic workers who are a hidden workforce, they are exploited. Sometimes they are very seriously exploited and abused. So I was looking at the role of the law in this area and how the law protects them or how the law disadvantages them. And then in 2013, I became a trustee of Kalayaan, this NGO on migrant, the main UK NGO on migrant domestic workers. And through my experience, by becoming a trustee, I came closer to the people who work with migrant domestic workers. And I also met, obviously, migrant domestic workers, clients of Kalayaan. This led me to decide to do an empirical project and interview migrant domestic workers in order to understand the effect of the law on them. So through my collaboration with Kalayaan, I learn a lot and I understand better my area of research.
Yes, Virginia, from your experience with Kalayaan and your research, there were 3 headline points that you could summarize for what's been useful for your own teaching. That would be great. Could you tell us about those?
Some key points, let's say, from my research with Kalayaan that I would use for my teaching. Some key messages I would try to pass to my students when I talk to them about domestic workers on the basis of my research are that the overseas domestic workers visa and other restrictive visas make workers vulnerable to exploitation, including very serious exploitation and abuse. Modern slavery is not the only kind of exploitation that we should be interested in. That modern slavery is, of course, a very serious harm, but there are other very serious and widespread aspects of exploitation that affect domestic workers, and that the law should address those as well. And another thing is that I'm trying to pass the message to students that it is something about, on one hand, we have theoretical research, difficult philosophical and conceptual questions. On the other hand, we're looking at what the law does, but also that it is always very interesting to look at the effect of the laws on the workers who are affected by the law. So something about the value then of empirical research for us legal academics.
Brilliant. And in terms of your future work, where do you see your research leading you next?
So thanks to this work on immigration, the migrant domestic workers visa and the effects of this visa, thanks to this work I realized something that one of your colleagues at Bristol has also written on, Bridget Anderson, how visas create vulnerability to exploitation. By looking at, as I said, I have examined the overseas domestic worker visa and I saw how it creates vulnerability to, it places workers in a position of vulnerability to exploitation. And then this made me think about other laws which seem to have a legitimate aim. They don't necessarily try to harm people, but even though they are laws with a supposedly legitimate aim, they make workers vulnerable to exploitation. So on that, thanks to this realization, I'm looking at different legislation and not just immigration rules, different legislation such as, say, universal credit, welfare conditionality, and see how they create vulnerability to exploitation on the one hand, and then I will be looking also at how the law, particularly human rights law, can help address this vulnerability to exploitation. So on the one hand, how the laws create vulnerability to exploitation, and on the other hand, how the law can help address some of these vulnerabilities to exploitation. I'm also looking at more theoretical concepts, and I will be looking at more theoretical concepts over the next couple of years, such as what do we mean by exploitation, which is a very difficult concept, but also the issues of structural injustice and the role of the law in creating structural injustice.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I think that will be really inspiring for students who are interested in migrant rights and labor exploitation. And thank you very much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for inviting me.